All right, guys, we are on Unit 2, Chapter 6, still in 1301. So today we're stepping into one of the most important turning points in world history, especially United States history. This is the conflict that's going to transform 13 British colonies into the United States. So this chapter is called Conflict in the Empire, the American Revolution. And the title really captures what happens. Before the revolution was a war, it was a breakdown of trust, of communication, and of relationship between the British and its colonies. And we're going to kind of look at the beginning at that relationship and for decades how the colonists had grown, prospered, and developed into their own identity. They didn't identify as British, whereas the British still wanted obedience, taxes, and loyalty. So pay attention to that as we move along, and you're going to see how this small disagreement slowly turns into this open rebellion that will become the American Revolution. All right, so look at the pictures on the slide. On the left-hand side, you see the colonists, and on the right-hand side, you see the British. So before we jump into the revolution itself, you need to understand the world of the colonists, how they lived for more than 150 years. So the British crown had pretty much left them alone for over 150 years. So during this time period, they are going to organize themselves more into colonies. So they're going to identify more as whatever colony, whatever geographic location they are at versus being British. So they had this unique independence already because the British Crown had stayed out of their business. They had colonial governments that they learned to run themselves. They had created their own laws. They collected their own taxes and they managed their own economic systems with almost no interference from the British. So you have a people who, for 150 years, had governed themselves um, and were moving along and creating and developing their own identities. They didn't walk around saying, I'm a loyal British subject. Instead, they were a Virginian, a New Yorker, a Pennsylvanian. They had this sense of belonging that shifted from the empire to the colony. And this shift is going to be one of the earliest roots of the American Revolution. So as you remember that these colonies weren't all founded for the same reason. Massachusetts was built by Puritans looking for religious freedom. Pennsylvania was founded by Quakers who believed in tolerance, religious tolerance. Virginia grew out of economic opportunities such as tobacco, land, and just pure profit. Maryland became a refugee for Catholics, named after Queen Mary. And Georgia was actually created as like a prison colony. And it was a haven for debtors. So the British sent whoever their prisoners were, which a lot were going to be in prison for debt, and they sent them over to Georgia. So you have different motivations, you have different cultures, you have different economics systems, different types of success as far as economics. Definitely different type of religious beliefs, although it's all the same theology. So you had 13 colonies that were independently different, but also 13 colonies that were massively, as a unit, different than the British population. So in 1760, you have over 2 million people. Each colony, like I said, its own structures. Some were considered royal colonies, so they had a little bit more direct control by the crown, but the majority of them were proprietary colonies or charter colonies. Charter colonies were more economic. They all did work under a system of mercantilism that still existed because that's how the British still got their money. And If we haven't gone into mercantilism, we'll probably go into it later. So when King George III becomes king, the British policy starts to kind of shift. Suddenly, Britain wants tighter control, more taxes, and more obedience from their colonies. And the colonists who had lived freely for generations weren't willing to give that up. Okay, so let's look into more things that are going to occur that are going to lead to the actual American Revolution. So you already know that you have this long-standing tension between the two. The colonists feel like they have their own identity within the different colonies, and the British are going to want to bring them back under control. All right, so one of the issues that the colonists are dealing with is they are constantly being pulled into these imperial wars. So the British were fighting with France almost all the time. They were always locked in a global struggle for power. And these weren't small, isolated conflicts. They would stretch across Europe, across the Atlantic, and into North America. So wars like King William's War, Queen Anne's War, and King George's War didn't just happen overseas in their home countries, they spilled directly into the colonies. So American settlers were pulled into European rivalries that they didn't even start, they didn't control anything, and they really had no interest in it. And every time that the British fought, they pulled in the colonists. So the colonists are really tired of being in all these wars. And the biggest war is going to be the French and Indian War, which is going to last from 1754 to 1763. North America, we call it the French and Indian War, but the rest of the world calls it the 7-Year War. And it's going to also not only be fought in North America, not only in the home countries, but in other areas. But we're just going to focus on the U.S. part. All right, so basically what's happening is France has strong alliances with different Native American tribes. In Native American tribes and their political alliance system, they're used to receiving different gifts, different tribute. And the French start changing that, and the French start, because they're losing money, they're losing land, they start to charge the Native American tribes that they're trading with different money and raise rents on their forts and just try and get more than they're supposed to from the Native American tribe. And these tribes, everything, is respect and alliance. So this is going to cause them to not be loyal to the French, to break alliances, and it's going to damage their trust. So some of the alliances as far as Native American tribes that the French have are going to be broken up and are going to start to collapse. Meanwhile, you have this major area called the Ohio River Valley. It's a region that is incredibly valuable. It's very rich in resources, and it's also very strategic and important just in its location. So you have different Indian tribes fighting among themselves also for this dominance that everybody's trying to seek. So this is going to kind of lead up to the French and Indian War, and we're going to get into it more on the next slide. I don't know if you can hear my colleague snoring on the chair. It's a very chunky black lab that is up here with me as I record, and she's snoring quite loud. So I apologize if it is picking that up. I told her not to bark while I was recording, but I apparently forgot to tell her not to snore. All right, so we're going to talk about the French and Indian War. And like I said, it's called the 7-Year War around the world, but the U.S. calls it the French and Indian War. It is not the French fighting the Indian. It is the French and Indian on one side, and then it is the British and the colonists on the other side. Okay, and I use Indian, Native American tribe, indigenous groups They're all the same. They are the people who were here, who had structures, infrastructure, systems, politics, economics, all the people who lived in North America before Europe and everybody came in and took everything. So I do not mean, if you hear me say Indian, it's just habit. I do not mean it disrespectfully. All right, so let's get back to what the French and Indian War and how it starts the American Revolution. So fighting breaks out in the Ohio River Valley, which, like we talked about before, is this huge, very, very resourceful and strategic location, and everybody wants control over it. So on one side, like I said, you have the British troops and the colonies, and on the other, you have the French forces supported by different Native American nations, tribes. Um, so it's not a small little frontier war. It's going to be a very brutal, widespread conflict that stretches across North America, forest, river, fort, settlements. It's not going to only affect people fighting far off, but they're also going to bring fighting into, the colonies, into their living space. So you have these different indigenous groups, and they play a major role in this war. So many of the tribes will side with the French, and they'll launch raids that threaten colonies on the frontier. For the colonists, this was terrifying. And because the colonies couldn't defend themselves effectively, England starts to step in. One of the reasons they step in. So British soldiers, British money, and British leadership start pouring into North America twofold, to protect the colonies and also to push back the French. The English and the French do not like each other, and they've always been in battle. So, nearly after a decade of fighting, the war finally ends with the Treaty of Paris on February 10th, 1763. And this treaty is going to completely reshape North America. So, France ceded all of its territories east of the Mississippi River to Britain. In other words, France's colonial presence in North America was basically over. So the British emerged from the war as the dominant imperial power on the continent. But here's the key point, and this is where the revolution begins to take shape. The war was incredibly expensive. Britain's national debt skyrocketed. And from the British perspective, the colonies had benefited from the war. Britain had defended them, protected their frontiers, and secured new lands for them. So the crown looked at the colonies and basically said, hey, you need to help pay for this. We've got a huge war debt, and you need to help us pay for this. And how they're going to want the colonists to pay is through taxation. That's how you collect money. If you're a government, you tax. So that decision is going to change everything. So to cover the cost of the war, of defending and administrating these new territories, the British began imposing new taxes, new regulations, and new restrictions on the colonists. And this is where you're going to have to think on your own and decide if you agree with the British or if you agree with the colonists. So what happens is the British are saying, like I said, we came over, not that they didn't want the land for themselves, right? We came over, we fought for you, we protected you, we got all this land for you. Now you need to be good British colonists and help us pay. For the colonist, it was you dragged us into this war. We've been here, we've been independent. Um, we're not going back under British rule. And that really is going to be where everything starts. So as the British start to tell the colonists they need to pay, they need to help, and the colonists are saying, I don't think so, the British realize that they've lost control of the colonies, and they try and bring the colonies back into control. All right, so just a quick recap. The British won, the French are gone. You might think that the colonies and the British would be celebrating, but they do not. Um, they are going to begin to start having a very strong, deep resentment on both sides. So again, for decades, the British and French have been locked in imperial rivalry, fighting for control, trying to split up North America, other areas across the world. And then this conflict, the French and Indian War, flows into America. They fight. The British have a huge war debt. They want the debt paid. They're going to start taxing the colonists, and they realize, hey, the colonies are out of control. So they want to get the colonies back in control. Okay. So some of the things that they're going to do is they're going to, because British are, like I said, they've got a huge war debt. They're drowned in. So they're going to look at the colonists as being selfish, ungrateful, and disloyal. But the colonists blame the Britain for the war. They didn't want the war. They didn't ask for it. They were brought into it. William Pitt, the British Prime Minister, promised during the war that British would cover all the cost of the war, that this wouldn't burden the colonies. And then, of course, they don't. And so they feel betrayed. You have some Native American resistance explode right after the war, which the most famous one is Pontiac's Rebellion. And this is a group that fought to defend their lands from British expansion. And then the British respond with what's called the Proclamation of 1763, which bans colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. And I'll show you later a map on this. So for the colonists, this is going to be a slap in the face. They had just fought this war. They had won against the French and the Native Americans, and they now wanted to access the lands that are further west. And now the British are telling them that they can't. So you've got this just perfect storm brewing. Uh, Britain is in debt, and they want the money and they want control. The colonists feel betrayed and they feel overtaxed. The Native American resistance is strong. Western settlement is now restricted. Both sides are blaming each other for the war and the consequences. So you have not just anger stirring, but you're going to have the colonists start to unite. So they're going to start seeing themselves not as individual, separate people, Virginians, New Yorkers, Pennsylvanians, but they're going to start seeing themselves as brought into this shared struggle. And that shared struggle is going to push them towards a revolution. All right, so this is going to be a little bit more helpful. So there you have about Pontiac's Rebellion, the important stuff of it. So what happens is look at the map of the Proclamation of 1763. Okay, that's the red line, that's the Appalachian Mountains. These are your different colonies in the yellow, the 13 colonies. Now you have to think why King George III is going to do this. This is, you have the Appalachian Mountains in the red. This is keeping the colonies contained. Okay, you've made this proclamation, declared that there will be no more white settlement west of that line. That's going to make the Native American tribes happy, but it's also going to contain the colonists. Right there, you can't go further. So when the British come over to try and control the colonies, they are kind of kept, kind of like keeping a baby or a toddler in a playpen. They're kept right there. They don't have to go across all the western land and try and find them if they start to spread out. So that's part of the reason that the British do the proclamation, is really to keep the colonists right where they want them so they don't spread out. Okay, so then they're going to start trying to collect money for this war debt, and a government to collect money, they tax. That's how you get money. Just like when you go to the store and your candy bar is $1, but you get up to the register and you pay, $1.10. I don't know what a candy bar is, obviously. That's tax that you're paying. That's money that goes to the government or the state. All right. So let's talk about their tax. They're going to tax the sugar, the molasses. Molasses is important because that is what the colonists are making their rum from. That's their alcohol. So they actually had a sugar tax that was more expensive. It was 6 pence, and they bring it down to 3 pence. But the colonists weren't paying it before the war. So they figure, well, we'll bring it down lower and surely we can start collecting money. Because remember, I told you that the colonists lived by their own rules for 150 years. So they just ignored a tax that was already on the molasses, um, and didn't pay it. So the British think, oh, well, we already have this tax going on, the Sugar Act, so we'll lower it 3 pence and then maybe they'll start paying it. So they have different reasons for this. Like I said, they're trying to get money for the war debt, but they also want to crack down on smuggling and restricted colonial trade. Okay, you were not, if you made a table out of the wood from your forest in your backyard, that wood is not yours. Those trees are not yours. They are the British mother country. So you can't just make a table and sell it to your buddy. You had to send the trees, the lumber to Britain, to Europe, and they would make the table and then they would sell it back to you. That's basic mercantilism. So they're doing the Sugar Act. They're trying to crack down on this because they don't want the colonies trading. And when we use trading, we're talking about exchanging money too, trading different wares for different things. So they think that this might work because the tax is lower. Um, but yeah, the colonists are not going to go for that at all. Then they have, after that, and you'll see this goes very fast, 1764, 1765, 1767. That's fast in old times. So they come up with the Stamp Act in 1765. Now, this is very, very important because what you have to remember is that in the colonies, they were trading, they were building things, they were getting married, they were uh, had deaths, had wills, and the Stamp Act is like this physical stamp. Like when you graduate, you have a stamp on your transcripts that says this is legitimately from the school. This is what this person did. It's a stamp. It's a legal stamp. Um, like a raised up stamp that you might see on legal documents like your birth certificate and stuff. So the colonist already was doing different government things. So the Stamp Act in 1765, it's going to hit everything. It's going to hit legal documents, newspapers, playing cards, any document. If the colonists had gotten married and they had a document and it said, yes, you're legally married, or yes, you legally own this business, that was all void, meaning that did not exist anymore. You were not married, you did not own that business, unless you now paid money to have the official British stamp on that document that said that, okay, the British approve it. Now, yes, it's a legal document. You are married. This is your business. So this affects all of life. And this is where the colonists are going to start to say that they have no colonial representation in Parliament, no taxation without representation. Okay. And this is where all of that starts. And we're going to go a little bit later into no taxation without representation. So basically, what that means is in the United States, when you're old enough to vote, you vote who you want to go to the state government. You vote who you want to represent you in the federal government. You vote who you want for president. Being that I feel like I'm talking to mostly students who should be under the age of 18 for the most part, um, you don't have the right to vote. You don't get to vote on this person who says they're doing A, B, C, D and send them off to represent you. Okay, you don't have that. So if you are working and you get a paycheck, and out of that paycheck, they're taxing you, the government is taking that bit of money out of your paycheck, you actually fall into this category of no taxation without representation. You're not letting me vote for who I want to represent me in government because I'm not 18 years old, but yet you're taking money out of my Chick-fil-A paycheck, Target paycheck, wherever you may work. The government's taking my money, but I have no say in anything I do. So that's the same thing, same basic principle. Since the British Parliament is over in, Britain. There's no one representing the colonists' interest in Britain. So they're saying we don't have a representative. We didn't get to nominate and send who we want to represent us in the British Parliament. Therefore, you cannot tax us. We will not support the government. We will not pay for the government if we don't have a voice in the government. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so that's the Stamp Act. So then you have what's called the Townshend Acts. Charles Townshend, he is the Prime Minister of British, so that's like an important person in Britain. In 1767, he creates this act. And what this act does is tax literally everything that you would use: paint, paper, lead, glass, tea. Covers everything. And then it adds in what's called the Quartering Act. Okay, what this means is by law now, colonists need to give up their home to house British soldiers. And we're not talking about just having a British soldier come and sleep on your floor or sleep in your extra room. They get your house. You go sleep on the floor if there's room, or the barn or whatever. They move into your house. They fully take control of your house. So this is going to be a huge deal. The other thing is called the rights of assistance, which means that you just can't come in and search my home for smuggled goods without a warrant. So just like now, if some authority wants to come into your house, it's illegal. They have to have a search warrant saying they're looking for ABC, and then they can come in. But they can't just knock on the door and say, hey, I'm searching your house, and come in. Okay? You have all that today because of this stuff back then. All right, so they can't move west. Their trade is now restricted. All of their goods are taxed by the British, so they're having to pay for everything. And their homes can be searched, and they can be forced out of their houses whenever a soldier asks. So all of this adds up to some very upset colonists. And because they're all upset, like I said before, they're not going to be 13 separate units. They're going to combine and become one unit. Okay, this is our last slide. All right, so you have all the taxations, which are important, the ones that we just listed before, so make sure you have those in your notes. So then we're going to start seeing some actual conflicts begin. The first one is called the Boston Massacre 1770. This Boston Massacre has a lot of different kind of historical arguments of what actually might have happened. So you have already very upset colonists. You have all of these British soldiers who are now coming in trying to take back the colonies. And what basically happens is both sides, of course, are suspicious of the other. And you have hackling and calling back and forth. And what the story is that an unarmed colonist threw a snowball at one of the British soldiers, and it wasn't just like a snowball. It was like a pretty nasty snowball, and ends up hitting them. And somebody says to fire, and they start to fire on the colonist, and it kills some colonists. 8 British soldiers are going to be tried. And John Adams, who is a very popular colonist, he's going to get 6 of the soldiers acquitted and sent back, which is going to kind of upset the colonists too, but he believes that they are innocent. So that happens March 5th, 1770, and it's called the Boston Massacre. There's still a lot of what really happened type things. Okay, the other thing is going to be called the Boston Tea Party. So you have this group called the Sons of Liberty, and they're called colonial patriots, kind of a rebel group. So they decide to create a dramatic protest against the taxation of tea. If you're listening from Texas, you know how much we love our tea. So this is Boston is right there, the hub, but it is a harbor. It's a harbor that ships come in and out of. It's a harbor that you have marine life in it. So you have food in the water, obviously, that the colonists are fishing out and part of their economic system. And what's going to happen is the Sons of Liberty, they're going to board a ship. They dress like Indians. You've heard the story. They board a ship and they get the tea and they dump 342 chests of the East Indian Company tea into the water. So today that tea would be worth millions of dollars. So this is a large amount of money. Okay. So there is that. This is not tea like Lipton tea bags that you get for $3 a box. This is tea leaves. And if you've ever gone into investing in some fine tea leaves, they can be $25 an ounce. So this is significant economically. Like I said, 342 chests at today's price would be millions of dollars. That's one thing. Okay, so the protest, they're meaning it to be symbolic, but it's going to become not only a very expensive protest, but it's also going to have a huge, real, very real environmental impact. So you have to think if you are throwing that much tea into an ecosystem, they kill all of the fish, all of the marine life. The water is contaminated, depleted of any type of oxygen, and the harbor is going to become temporarily shut down. So there's no trade movement, no ships coming in and out. Um, and they've killed the whole trade of fishing and whatever else they pulled out of the harbor. And then they've killed the entire ecosystem. So for Boston residents, they've lost two major income sources. Okay, the trade coming in and out, and also the destruction to what they got out of the harbor. So we don't really think about that when we say Boston Tea Party. It's just kind of this funny little thing, but it really isn't. It really had very destructive and devastating consequences. So after that, you're going to have what's known as the coercive acts, but the colonists are going to call them the intolerable acts. These are going to be laws designed to punish Massachusetts and to make an example out of Boston. Okay. And one of the most devastating, like we talked about, is going to be the closure of the harbor. And they're also going to have to deal with the cost and destruction of the tea. So they're going to have to repay that. So ships can't enter or leave, merchants couldn't trade, fishermen couldn't work, everyday people will suffer. But instead of breaking the colonial resistance by these extra acts, it's only going to cause the colonies to unite even stronger. They're going to start committees of correspondence. They're going to start different committees to pull together unity. They're going to start spreading the news. They're going to start coordinating their movements. So when we look at the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party, we're not just looking at two isolated events. We're looking at moments that are going to transform anger into unity. And that anger into unity is going to become unity into a revolution. So these events are going to convince many of the colonists that Britain no longer cares about protecting their rights. It only wants to violate them. And this is going to push us closer to declaring independence.